Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, August 18th. Here's what's on tap this week. China's economy is sputtering. Prices are falling, debt is increasing, unemployment is spiking. What does this mean for the global economy and the rebound in the U.S. and Western economies around the world? Then we'll take a look at a historic summit taking place in Camp David as we are talking, with leaders of the United States, South Korea, and Japan coming together for the first time for the meeting just of the three of them, creating a new security framework for the Indo-Pacific. What does this say about the state of the world and the strength of the relationship between these three vital allies? And then, finally, the AI race is heating up as the competition for talent and chips is racing across the world. What does this mean for the future of technology? And is there still time to regulate the outcome of this race? Here to talk about these issues are the reporters that cover them. Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian is China reporter for Axios. Carla Anne Robbins is senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and formerly of the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. And Ryan Heath is technology reporter, also from Axios. Good morning, all. Great to see you. Wonderful to have you all back. Bethany, let's start with you. The economy in China is really in trouble, as far as we can tell. You know better than anyone else, having just published a terrific book, so I'll give the plug right here. Beijing Rules, on how Beijing is using weaponizing the economy to get its way. By the way, shortlisted for Best Business Book of the Financial Times. Congrats, both on the publication and on that. That's great to have. But when you look across the Taiwan Straits, increasingly shorter from where you're sitting right now, and you see what's happening in China, what are you seeing, and how do you think this will play out in terms of China's relationship with its immediate neighbors?
Yeah, thanks, Ivo. So what we've seen in 2023 is that there were some pretty high expectations for an economic recovery in China. Last year, the economy was totally battered by the zero COVID policy, but people were optimistic that once that policy was lifted and there were no longer all these shutdowns and lockdowns, domestic travel was restored, international travel was restored, that we would see this economic recovery. And that economic recovery just has not materialized. And in fact, the numbers from China's economy most recently in July just, keep getting grimmer and grimmer. We're seeing, reductions in the manufacturing sector, in imports, in the real estate sector, maybe most dramatically. So, what's underlying this? And probably there's people are debating there's probably two to three main factors. And the biggest one is that probably this was to some extent inevitable for years. 10 to 15 years. Economists have been saying that the Chinese real estate sector is a bubble. What's been happening is that basically since the financial crisis in 2008, the Chinese government implemented all this stimulus to get local governments to pay to develop the land. So local governments would sell the land to developers who would build these apartments or other kinds of projects, and those would get sold. And it created a lot of economic growth, a lot of GDP growth. And in fact, for years, China's GDP sector has accounted for 20 to 30% of its GDP, which is an extraordinarily high percentage. That I believe it's the highest in the world. And so that as a result of that, the debt, local debt and other forms of debt in China has just gotten heavier and heavier and heavier. In the U.S. government, in the U.S. we talk about this, the federal government debt. In China, it's the local government debt. And finally, things seem to have come to a screeching halt. And we've seen huge developer after huge developer enter a crisis, file for bankruptcy. Just today, Evergrande filed for the largest developer in China filed for bankruptcy in the U.S. And we're seeing, other fallout from this. There is sky high youth unemployment. So up to 20% of China's urban youth are unemployed. Now, overall, the Chinese economy is that sounds bad because it doesn't sound like the Chinese economic miracle that we know. But to be clear, we're looking at probably just short of 5% growth this year. Now, that is much lower than we've been seeing. And that relatively high number for a developed country hides a lot of vulnerabilities and weaknesses. But we're not talking about an actual recession at this point. But the Chinese government is, it seems that Xi Jinping is committed this time to letting the real estate sector deflate. And he's facing a dilemma because if it fully deflates, we could really the economy could really come grinding to a halt. But if he tries to keep kicking the can forward, down the road and keeping more stimulus, it's possible that China's economy is going to get stuck in this model of growth that has really run out of steam, and that could prevent the Chinese economy from taking a leap to the next level. So that's kind of where things stand.
It's a complicated but somewhat dire picture. And Ryan, one of the things that is also going on is this attempt to become technologically self-sufficient, even as the United States is making it more and more difficult for U.S.-based technology and now investment even to support the Chinese economy. To what extent is this, first step was the Chinese, this internal focus on trying to get sufficient self-sufficiency in the high-tech sectors, EV, robotics, quantum, and of course AI and semiconductors, helping to stall the growth of an economy that in the end needs to grow only through increased productivity and innovation rather than increased labor. Well, we've been through that.
Yeah, I'm not sure we can attribute many direct negative effects, but the problem China really faces is that ramping up your industrial base and all of your technical know-how in all of these fields takes a very long time. So I have no doubt that China will eventually become self-sufficient in all of these fields, and probably quicker than if the US didn't apply all of this pressure now. But it doesn't seem like that is arriving quick enough to save the economy from maybe not a recession, but at the very least to keep it going along at that sort of 6 to 10% growth rate that we've all become so familiar with over the last 30 years. And so actually, I have a couple of questions for Bethany, really, also, which is that we've heard for such a long time that if growth fell below 5 or 6%, that could be a trigger for social unrest. And I wonder what the latest thinking is on that. And I see it sort of a number of other factors at play here as well, where China, like many countries, has an aging population, and it very specifically had a population control policy, the one-child policy, for many decades. And I feel like maybe the country is reaping some of what it sowed with that policy and not having enough people to keep juicing the economy when innovation doesn't do the job on its own, let's say. And also, China, let's not forget, it's a communist state, but it's not yet a welfare state. So it had very low levels of consumer spending and very high levels of saving. And I wonder what pressure might be applied to get people to keep spending rather than putting that sort of money under the mattress and trying to save for the health emergency or the other rainy day that the state doesn't tend to step in and help people with.
All good questions. Bethany? Do you have answers for all of them?
Well, I have thoughts. So for social unrest, this is absolutely a major concern of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's one of the dilemmas that Xi Jinping is facing is, if he doesn't step in with stimulus, will things get so dire that there is, a lot of social unrest. And, in the CCP's case, they have an extremely low tolerance for that. When I say social unrest, I don't mean that people are going to rise up and overthrow the party, but the CCP just, any protest at all, just, make it break out in hives. And last year we saw the spread of these protests in more than 100 cities across China by mortgage owners who, as part of this, the slow train wreck of this, the real estate bubble bursting, they, as about 90% of households do in China, had bought apartments before they were actually finished being constructed. And they had been promised, that it would be finished by this date and they could move in, and that would be, their nice life. And for a lot of these people, this is their life savings, maybe even the life savings of their parents or other relatives. And when these big developers have failed, the money just isn't there to keep on building these apartments. And so it's this systemic issue all across China where people have, they don't have their life savings anymore. And they also don't have an apartment. They don't have a place to live. And so that created this, really broad, all these protests. And that's certainly a fear. I would say that sometimes when I hear people talk about, if the economy slips in China, there will be social unrest. I would view that in the same lens by which we view any other country. China isn't like all that different. I think there is this idea, and it used to be more true than it is, that there was a social contract. And that really was the case in the 90s and the 2000s, let's say, that the CCP was basing its legitimacy no longer, because it basically, cracked down on people in 1989 and it said, if you just let us do our thing politically and you stop asking for political rights, we promise you prosperity. And, that was true. That was the main, that was the CCP's main claim to legitimacy for a long time. But Xi Jinping has very strategically expanded CCP legitimacy by, making China, restoring China's place in the center of the global stage. And many Chinese people are truly proud of that. They really feel proud of that. Many Chinese people genuinely feel that the Chinese Communist Party isn't perfect, but has led China in a right direction. And, one of the things that the party has done under Xi is really fan the flames of nationalism. And that's always a pressure valve, that the party can release if things get bad domestically. They can start blaming, hostile foreign forces again. So just to, say that, yeah, there's probably, if the economy gets bad, there's going to be more protests, but I wouldn't expect revolution.
Carla, seen from the United States, we saw the president of the United States making some comments on Xi Jinping being in a really tough place, talking about the very issues we've been talking about. Is this a good thing or a bad thing for the United States if China has an economic downturn as it is experiencing now?
I think that despite Biden, I think they're trying to limit their schadenfreude in part because they don't know. Yellen said this week, Secretary of Treasury Yellen said this week, of course, the big news is Yellen saying that she ingested magic mushrooms when she was visiting in China. But Janet Yellen did say this morning on Monday that China's slowing economy was a risk factor for the United States. But all told, they think they're reasonably, insulated from it. They're concerned about a rising dollar and what that could do for U.S. exports in other places around the world as well. But they think they're reasonably insulated from it. There is concern, exactly what Bethany was talking about, which is much more likely that she will try to, fan nationalist flames. And what could this possibly mean? Is, everyone's been sitting around going, what does this mean for Taiwan, for Ukraine? What could domestic pressures inside of China mean for Taiwan and for potentially a spiraling conflict with the U.S.? If she feels that he's backed into the corner for the economy. So that's, I think, the main thing you're hearing in Washington.
Yeah, and so I think that's actually, and whoever wants to jump on this, there is a dilemma, which is, do you want a weak China or a strong China? And strong China poses a challenge of having the capacity to challenge the United States and others around the world. But a weak China has an incentive to divert attention from what's happening at home. And we've never really resolved, it seems to me, in our own minds, certainly not since we gave up on the idea that economic openness would lead to political liberalization, which clearly hasn't happened. This question of, do we want China to succeed or do we want China to fail? The administration keeps talking about the importance of that. We're not trying to have China fail, but at the same time, a successful China is also a huge challenge. Biden and just they. Yellen goes over there because they want to lower the tension. She doesn't use this, decoupling. She doesn't even use the word de-risking. And then this week, Biden comes back and announces another ban, this time, as you mentioned, Evo, on new investments in China's high-tech industry and specifically on companies, all of the things that Ryan was talking about and that Bethany was talking about. So is this ambivalence on their part? Do they have an inconsistent policy? I think they haven't figured this one out. Bethany, when you're sitting in Taiwan, how are they looking at it? And perhaps even more important to their economic and social and political well-being is the answer to that question.
Yeah, I mean, there's different, Taiwan is being affected in different ways by this. And, Taiwan's economy, about 30% of Taiwan's economy is wrapped up with China in some way. So the economic relation there is very, very close, very, very intertwined. That's something that, President Tsai Ing-wen has tried to pull back from with what, the DPP calls the new southbound policy, which is basically diversifying Taiwan's trade partnerships, especially with Southeast Asia. And that has been not super successful. And Taiwan's economy is still really closely tied up with China. And, Taiwanese business people, have already seen effects from this. The increasing pressure that Taiwanese people feel in China, the political pressure they feel, combined with, falling economic incentives to be there, mean that a growing number of Taiwanese business people with factories in China or other businesses there are trying to get out. They're coming back to Taiwan. They're moving their factories to Southeast Asia because, the cost benefit analysis is just not what it was. And yes, certainly the Taiwanese government is very concerned about the future and, a very aggressive China. And the parties take, they have sort of a different stance. The DPP, is very, very Beijing skeptical. The KMT thinks, well, if we just are nice to China, they'll be nice to us. But yeah, this instability, a kind of not instability, but economic crisis in China, and the way that could possibly intersect with the political system, could be a real tinderbox, and not even necessarily on purpose. As the Chinese Navy becomes, much more aggressive. This week we saw, just a few days ago, we saw the Chinese Navy with the Russian Navy sailed ships again by Okinawa. As this happens more and more, the risk of miscalculation rises, and you could have a conflict even without the actual intention of that. And I'll just, maybe sound in a little bit on a, weak China, strong China. I think that maybe the Taiwanese government and probably DC have a similar feeling, if they're being honest, which is they want China to succeed in some ways and fail in other ways. They definitely want the Chinese economy to succeed. No one would benefit from an economic crisis of some kind in China that would have massive reverberations around the world over time. But I don't think anyone in DC really wants China's political project to succeed. And as I've written in my book, that is, unifying, among other things, unifying the economy with authoritarian political values and systems, which China has so far been very successful at. And to the extent that China's economy is not as strong or as compelling as it was before, that means that China, in that sense, has less authoritarian political power on the global stage.
Yeah, that's, I think, a really smart way of looking at the two. It's not an either or; it's an and both in some ways to think about it. And it's really, in the end, it's not really clear that we have any control over it anyway. It's something that the Chinese and the Chinese people and the Chinese government will be able to. We have some influence, but really not a huge control over it. But a good segue, Carla, to our next sort of next focus. This really remarkable summit in Camp David, the first time that Biden has invited foreign leaders to come to Camp David, and the first time that these three leaders, the leaders of South Korea, Japan, and the United States, are getting together, not on the margin of some other summit, but actually for what will become one of a annual ritual. This is interesting. Where does it come from, and what does it mean?
Why are we here?
Why are we here?
Why are we here? So Seoul and Tokyo have been taking a series of steps to try to heal which are very bitter historic wounds going back to Japan's brutal occupation. And the U.S. has been very invested in this process, encouraging this process. And the Biden administration, officials say, is now interested in what U.S. officials are describing as institutionalizing this alliance, in many ways to make sure that it goes on past Biden's term if that happens. People are very worried if Trump comes back that, remember the transactional relationship with the threats that were made to South Korea and Japan. They want to institutionalize this. So there's going to be a lot of focus on what's going to happen afterwards to continue this and to continue to encourage Japan and South Korea to deepen their relationship and to deepen the security relationship with the United States. So what are we going to see out of it? They're going to be the deliverables that we always see. What we're not going to see is a NATO Article 5 commitment. That's what the Chinese keep warning against, and nobody in the White House is saying they're going to get that. But there are going to be a lot of other commitments to consult on issues of mutual security, annual summits, as you mentioned, annual trilateral military exercises, regular missile defense exercises, certain to make the Chinese crazy, deeper data sharing on North Korean ballistic missile threats. I'm looking at my list here, creation of a three-way hotline. Japan is not going to sign on, we are told, to a recently created U.S.-South Korea nuclear consultative group. And I don't think you're going to hear a lot about economics, in part because the South Koreans and the Japanese are deeply ambivalent and uncomfortable about the pressure that the U.S. has been putting on them to decouple from China. They are very unlikely to sign on to this new investment ban. The Japanese have been supportive on the earlier Commerce Department ban on export of advanced semiconductor. Ryan will know a lot more about this than I will. Technology. South Koreans got a 1-year waiver. They're probably going to apply for another waiver. So I think they're going to probably sidestep the economic issue as much as they can because they are even more integrated in the Chinese economy than we are. And I think the big focus is going to be on security. There will be one conversation, though, about supply chain disruption. I think that will be the big focus on the economy.
Yeah, I think this is. I think that sums it up really well. And the security dimension. And we shouldn't forget, although there won't be a trilateral Article 5, there are bilateral Article 5s that the United States has signed with both Korea and Japan. And in the Japanese case, an understanding that the regional threats that affect their security now should be taken into account too, which is code word for Taiwan.
But I think they're going out of their way to not say this is not a NATO.
No, absolutely. So, but we shouldn't take the opposite view, which is that there aren't any Article 5 commitments. Right. They exist, and they're very important, and they are extraordinarily important for the two recipient countries, South Korea and Japan. But I think you're right, Ryan, on the economic side and sort of the technology side. There is a change, clearly, particularly more so in Tokyo than there is in some ways in Seoul on the technology side. After all, Samsung is, the big kid on the block when it comes to semiconductors and so many other things. They're not about to cut themselves off the Chinese market, but this discussion about high technology that we just had before on the Chinese economy will inevitably become part of that trilateral discussion, even if they can't see any movement. So how do you see what's happening on that part in the cooperative framework work?
Well, I think Australia learned the hard way that you can't neatly separate the economic from the security and the other geopolitical questions. I think it will take longer for the South Koreas and Japans of the world to arrive at the similar conclusion. They are slightly bigger, they're in a different geographic situation, but it all trends in the same direction. So I don't think you can neatly separate it out. But because of those economic interests and because of the history between South Korea and Japan, that does make the progress that is happening right now all the more extraordinary. So I think it's absolutely true that South Korea is going to try and get more waivers on the tech side of things. Samsung feels quite caught out by NVIDIA, an American company that makes a particular type of chip that is very useful and efficient for these latest artificial intelligence technologies. Samsung doesn't like that. It wants to shore up all of the markets in any way it can, and just giving in to US pressure to stay out of China. And it's not just Samsung, there are other smaller chip makers there as well. They're really not interested to do that. So it's going to take a lot of US pressure to get South Korean companies and the government signed up to those sorts of agreements. And let's not forget, I don't even know how to overstate it. Samsung is the South Korean government in many ways, not in the literal sense, but imagine sort of Amazon or Walmart being 10 times bigger than they are and having the level of influence that would come with that on the Congress, on the executive branch in Washington. That is the sort of role that Samsung plays in the South Korean economy, and it's why you get those sort of dynamics on these discussions.
And Bethany, I think the other issue that I think is important is on the history issue that is so beset the relationship between Korea and Japan, and a really remarkable set of initiatives by the two leaders, in particular by the South Korean President Yoon, who has, against lots of political opposition at home, come a long way to sort of try to bridge the gap and move on. I think the two leaders have now had 4 meetings in the last 4 months. Extraordinary level of engagement. How vulnerable do you think they are politically at home?
Well, in Japan, in Japan has been, Japan is a pretty healthy democracy, but it's in some ways kind of a one-party state. The LDP has held has held the office of the prime minister ever since basically the founding of Japan's democracy, with one exception, which was about a decade ago, and that was very, very brief. So, if we're talking about vulnerability, certainly, on the parliamentary level, and the status of the prime minister, within his government or within his party, is one thing. But the LDP is they're going to be the party no matter what. And South Korea is that it's not the same. I think what is so important to remember here is how deep these feelings run in both countries, and it's understandable to me on the part of South Korea. It's not really understandable on the part of Japan. These terrible atrocities of World War II, and if you compare Japan with Germany and their response, Germany has, they've done such a good job, compared to most, countries in the world who've had terrible histories, of trying to make up for it, of trying to be honest about it, of trying to get their history books right, of trying to have, the right kinds of monuments. And Japan is just, almost the opposite. They in recent years have, removed sections from their history books that play up or that even that talk about some of Japan's atrocities during the war. In Berlin, there are definitely no monuments to, Hitler or the Nazi Party. And in Tokyo, you have Yasukuni Shrine, which is, a monument to martyrs and includes some major war criminals from World War II, and various issues. So on the South Korean side, the memories there are so painful. But in Japan, you do still have this core of nationalism, of people who are on some spectrum of thinking that that was a long time ago. We need to let it go. Japan is really great. And you still get people who really, believe in the uniqueness of Japanese identity and race. I've met people like that myself, which is totally terrifying. So, it is a thorny issue. And I personally wouldn't say that I'm super optimistic about the relationship between Japan and South Korea becoming truly warm. Why is this happening? It's happening for exactly one reason, because the threat that they're facing from China, and to a lesser extent North Korea, is so great.
Yeah, no, I think the external, yeah. Go ahead, Carla, please.
And the South Koreans, Bethany, I think, summed up Japan, and I'm not an Asianist, but I know a reasonable amount about Korea. I think Yoon is in a much more vulnerable place. He's going to face legislative elections, and I think it's in April, and people are predicting he's not going to do well, because this is not what he has done, and he has really bent over backwards. Including on the forced labor issue. He raised the money privately rather than getting the Japanese to do the reparations on this. So he's gone out of his way to do this, to make this happen. And it is not popular inside of Korea, even though they're feeling an enormous amount of pressure from North Korea. And it is not a popular thing that he has done. And he has made this happen, I think. And so he is under a lot of, going to be under a lot of stress no matter what happens. And I think the two militaries, both in Japan and South Korea, are not crazy about this. And this is one of the reasons why the White House is so determined to, quote, institutionalize this, because not only are they worried about what will happen if Biden isn't reelected, they're worried about whether or not this has legs in both Japan and South Korea, in part because of domestic political attitudes, but in part also because of the attitudes of their militaries.
I think that's part of what they're trying to do with Camp David, and this emphasis on institutionalizing the relationship. I think Rahm Emanuel, our ambassador in Japan, called it infusing the DNA of three countries to make this impervious to domestic politics, because the reality is the foreign and strategic situation compels them to work together. But domestically, both our and, of course, the domestic politics in Japan and particularly in South Korea is what makes this vulnerable. And we've tried this before and it didn't work because of exactly that. So this is the balance act that I think we'll be looking at as things move forward. But on the other hand, the strategic situation does require these countries to collaborate, and I imagine that people in Taiwan, Bethany, are hoping that this one not only succeeds but it sticks.
Sure, and I can get to Taiwan in a second, but I want to just jump in and add one more sort of level of complexity here, which is it's not just the domestic situations in South Korea and Japan that could make this, trilateral relationship vulnerable. It's also pressure from China. So if we look, so South Korea it's much more difficult for them to be outspoken about China's human rights abuses or anything else when it comes to China, because they are totally reliant on Beijing for their own security, or they view themselves as that way because of Beijing's relationship with North Korea. And, South Korean diplomats have told me this time and again that, they can personally feel hawkish and they're towards China or concerned about China. And people in the government can feel that way. But at the end of the day, it's very difficult for South Korea to take really strong actions or make really, strong statements that Beijing doesn't like, unless it's on, something that relates to South Korea's, core security interests. But for example, let's look back at around 2016, 2017, when the U.S., when South Korea was going to agreed to deploy or wanted to deploy the U.S. THAAD missile defense system with North Korea in mind. But its range would also go into Chinese territory technically, and so Beijing, was really upset about this and launched this whole economic coercion campaign against South Korea, against South Korean, retail giant, against South Korean. K-pop stars weren't allowed to come into China and sing their concerts, and their music couldn't stream. So there is also this external pressure on South Korea, and right now, the stars have aligned in such a way that it's been okay for South Korea to do this. But you can totally imagine, they're under pressure from the Biden administration. They have their own interests in mind. But if, Biden were to lose the election or, in 2028 or whatever, a different president comes in, if there isn't this, this countervailing pressure from the US side, but there is this pressure from the Chinese side, it's very easy to see South Korea stepping away. Regarding Taiwan, so probably the single most important country for Taiwan, besides the U.S. in terms of their defense, is Japan. And Japan has been, more publicly making more statements, making that clear that they do view. And Japan's gotten pushback at this even domestically, but saying that the defense of Taiwan is a Japanese national security issue. And if you look at Okinawa, I was just there back in May on a reporting trip. Japan has been realigning, its military, especially missile deployment to the south, away from the northern part, away from the Soviet era concerns, and towards the south, towards China. And Okinawa is just 1 hour flight away from Taiwan, and it's crucial for the any defense of Taiwan. And so Japan's the Japanese government obviously wants the U.S. The military facilities to be in Okinawa. So for Japan, it really is an issue that is so tightly tied, to their own national security. But for Taiwan, this is like their big other country, which is kind of sad because Japan's military is like not strong. But that would be the country. If people always say if the U.S. were to fall out for some reason, we get an isolationist president in the office or something, Japan would be Taiwan's last big hope. And so for them to have these two, strong East Asian strong democracies working together, finally, this is nothing but good news for Taiwan.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and you put that you put that very well. And the critical access to the South China Sea comes, at least one of the two axes is through the Taiwan Japanese waters, on the north side. So it is a critical bottleneck as well for the Chinese, which is why they're trying to open it up and keep it open. Terrific conversation, Ryan. Let's shift to the race for AI. You covered this closely. I was struck by the UAE and the Saudis all of a sudden buying up as much of these chips that NVIDIA makes, not the top of the line, but a lot of other ones, and the Chinese trying to make sure they could get as much computing power with these chips as well. There really seems to be an incredible acceleration of investment in chips and talent and everything else. And you have this sense of the barn doors are open, everything is possible, and you do wonder who's watching the guys to make sure that this stuff is not going to do great harm.
The answer is there isn't a global governance structure in place, Evo. It doesn't mean it won't arrive or that it wouldn't be popular if it did arrive, but we're a while off from that. Remember, there is no perfect analogy, but when we tried to bring in nuclear safety watchdogs, they did come into existence, but it took 13 or 14 years to get them up and running from the big technical breakthrough. Hopefully it won't take that long with AI, but we're not talking months, we are talking years. And there are a number of different sort of interlocking jigsaw pieces in terms of who is winning this AI race. If we look at it from a pure innovation perspective, the US is in the lead, and very particularly San Francisco is in the lead. Just the city of San Francisco, not even the broader Bay Area, has as many successful AI startups as the rest of the US combined, which has more than the rest of the world. So it is highly concentrated in many respects. And NVIDIA, this chip-making company, they're not a startup, they're the latest trillion-dollar company, but they are in the Bay Area, and they really are the big winners of 2023 in terms of how much they've grown and sort of the lock they've put down on their markets. So like compared to something like OpenAI, it changed the conversation, but it's not making money the way a chip maker like NVIDIA is. And now things are starting to open up because the Middle East is able to open its wallet and obtain some of these very important chips called GPUs. But also Meta, the company that owns Facebook, they released a very big, quite successful large language model for anybody to use. And the UAE in particular has found ways to improve upon that and build upon that. And that's changing a lot of the dynamics on how this technology gets deployed. But that's also a sign that things don't have to be as concentrated in the Bay Area as they might be. And another great example there is the Midwest is America's robot capital. So the Midwest didn't make these AI innovations, but they're amongst the most successful in applying them. So there's lots of different perspectives to bring to bear here. And then when we think about talent and skills, we have new data from LinkedIn this week that shows an absolute explosion of employers wanting AI skills and people claiming to have them. Now, this is all self-reported, so we don't really know how true these numbers are. But what is clear is that very small countries that are very digitally engaged and have very good education systems like Singapore, Ireland, Finland, they are the ones with the most concentration of AI skills at the moment. Over time, that advantage, I think, will dissipate. The US has the best universities. It literally has more talent, as does China. But for now, these small countries are making a good play at becoming AI hubs. And then just finally, China and the EU are ahead when it comes to regulating and putting in place some of those guardrails. They're both finalizing AI regulations right now. The US is a long way away. I just don't think there will be anything like an omnibus AI bill next year. The numbers don't exist in Congress for that. So it's going to be a slower haul here. But you are starting to see agencies sort of build AI into how they enforce their existing rules. But it's going to be a long time before you get a big AI agency or something like that on the books.
It's fascinating, sort of the diversity of how to think about this in a both regional U.S. and then a global perspective. Ryan, that's very helpful, and I think it underscores how incredibly difficult it is for states and state apparatuses in their way that they are traditionally address policy and policymaking to even get their hands on it. I think one of the reasons it's not happening in the United States is not only because we have a dysfunctional Congress, it's just really hard to figure out how you would regulate and affect this in a way, and the Europeans just they tend to be better at regulating than making, so they are quicker at doing that stuff. But it's a very complicated issue, and Carla, when you look at it, what sort of, how worried are you, and how worried should we be that this stuff is accelerating at a pace that even some of the innovators don't say they don't quite know how far and how fast it's going?
Look, one of the things that's so interesting about these countries in the Middle East that seem so determined to get it is, what do they want it for? And how much of it do they want to increase their repressive capabilities? And that's, one of the big questions when you talk about regulation. The Europeans have developed this draft law, and talks about limitations of using AI for live facial recognition. The United States, White House had this meeting last month, and there were a bunch of voluntary commitments that were pretty squishy that came out. But these are some pretty, fundamental questions that I think that we have to ask. We talked about what technology were we going to sell to South Africa at one point during apartheid itself. Do we have to think about what sort of technology are we going to develop domestically? What are we going to use that there's going to be invasion of privacy and within the United States? But we also have to think, if we are dominating so much of this technology, what are we going to sell to repressive countries that are our allies, that we know that one of the reasons they want this is to increase their authoritarian control?
No doubt that's one of the reasons, one of the utilities of it. And Bethany, if there is a superstar in this picture, it's in Taiwan. It's TSMC. Everybody else may be designing this stuff, but it's all being produced in those huge fabs and foundries outside of Taipei City that I was able to visit a couple of months ago. It is really an impressive what they're doing, and the Taiwanese are making clear, whatever happens in the proliferation of technology, that stuff ain't proliferating from Taiwan, because what makes Taiwan so very special. So how is TSMC in particular, but the government, looking at this race, and do they feel good about it, or are they concerned that they may be losing their edge?
Well, I think the Taiwanese government and Taiwanese business and TSMC itself have definitely capitalized on not just the economic implications of TSMC's dominance, but even on, also, and maybe more importantly, the political implications. There's a kind of a whole, a school of thought in DC, and I'm not sure if I agree with it, but there's a whole school of thought that really the only reason that the US even cares about Taiwan is because of TSMC. That maybe, basically you're saying that one company is the only reason that Taiwan even still exists as a de facto independent country, which is pretty extraordinary. It's certainly true that TSMC itself has single-handedly, helped make Taiwan a richer country. And the importance of TSMC is such that you get statements from people. I forget who it was in the U.S. who suggested this, but that if China were to annex Taiwan, that the U.S. should actually bomb TSMC, which is just kind of extraordinary. Kind of like we had to destroy the village to save it, kind of a mentality. Yes, certainly, like TSMC, as you know, Evo, is like one of the most secure facilities in the world. Like, it's really like, they're very, like, very, very careful about industrial espionage and about everything like that. To the extent that they're worried, I think Ryan is probably much better placed to answer the kind of question is how much should TSMC and the Taiwanese government at large be worried that other countries, other places might be able to replicate what they've done. I'm not really sure.
I'm pretty sure that the people who are calling for bombing the TSMC had no idea what TSMC was 3 years ago.
I'm sure.
I'm absolutely convinced of that. And so the idea that Taiwan equals TSMC is really a remarkable lack of understanding of history. But I think, Ryan, how critical is TSMC, number one? And as a final question, sort of to get us out of the program. What should we look to next in this thing? What are you watching to see how this story evolves in a way that is truly remarkable, including the fact that, frankly, I didn't know what TSMC was 3 years ago, and I imagine a lot of us didn't in one form or another who are listening. I know the three of you, of course, by definition, knew, but I didn't.
Well, on the first literal question, TSMC is hard to replicate even when you are TSMC. They've had to delay a plant in Arizona because they don't have access to enough skilled labor to get it done in time. So TSMC succeeding, even in a China-occupied Taiwan, depends upon the cooperation of a lot of people. It doesn't just happen automatically. But we saw the British bomb the French Navy when France fell in 1940. So there's not historical precedent for extreme actions in those sorts of situations. But I wouldn't sort of go all in on that theory, I guess is what I would say. And then in terms of what's next, I think we really have to look at how different regulated industries, older and more traditional industries, start to use AI. I think that's when the real change at a massive scale occurs, when those companies or governments that have operated often even in paper-based systems until now or until recently, when they figure out how to reorganize their data to be able to apply it with all these new AI technologies, that's when the real huge change is going to occur, and all the benefits will spread, not just to the innovation hubs, but across America and across sort of any advanced economy. And I think that's going to take longer than we expect. It's not going to be like the hype of the last 6 months, but it's definitely coming. And that's where the money and where the social transformation is going to come from when it does.
Ivo, you are muted.
I'm sorry. We have, believe it or not, the Air and Water Show here, and the F-16s and the Blue Angels are flying over my house. So I'm trying to figure out a way not to say that. But what I wanted to say, one of the things that I think we will not see anytime soon is AI taking over this show, because the kind of capacity for reasoning and intelligent debate that we are seeing here is, as yet, not yet something that AI can do. So I thank you all, humans, for being with us here today. To three of you, Carla Robbins, Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, and Ryan Heath, and of course, all of you who are watching and listening from wherever you are. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back next week with one more edition of This Week. Till then, have a great weekend.
Bye.